The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Advocacy Ambassadors Network webinar on developing campus-based advocacy materials. I'm Kenneth Polishuk, and I'm here with Beth Buellman, and we have Kinchel Dorner and John Keller presenting today. So before we start the webinar, I'm going to go through a couple of technical slides. So the presentation will be about 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. At the moment, we have all of you muted on our end, but as the discussion portion starts, I will unmute you all. If you want to mute yourself, that's also fine, but just make sure to unmute your mic when you ask a question. For any technical issues, you can go to the following website. To hide your control panel, you have that orange button in the upper left-hand corner. And you can sign on either with with a mic or through your phone, and you can switch between the two at any time during the webinar without actually leaving the webcast. And if you have any telephone audio problems, you can click the problem dialing in button for an alternative phone number to dial. And now I'll turn it over to Beth.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us. We're looking to have a very exciting webinar today around developing advocacy materials. And our presenters are going to discuss the resources and the processes they use to develop advocacy materials for different audiences. And these materials are drawing upon campus-specific data and or stories. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Kinchel.
Thank you, Beth. My name is Kinchel Dorner. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School at South Dakota State University. I've been the Dean here for 6 complete years now, and I came to this institution to really rebuild, the mechanics and the structure of the graduate student office. We're kind of a centralized application and a centralized degree vetting office like many of us. And most of my activities up to this point have been internal, trying to improve some of those internal processes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But you should know South Dakota. If you don't know, South Dakota is directly south of North Dakota, and that's the red state. We're on the extreme eastern side, so we're really 15 miles from Minnesota, and so we pull a lot of students from Minnesota in our institution. For land grant, we're relatively small, about 12,005 is our total enrollment, around 1,600 or so graduate students. Our PharmD students aren't counted in that, but our Doctor of Nursing practice actually is. And we're largely domestic. We're trying to internationalize our campus, but most of about a quarter of our graduate students are actually international. But you can see the breakdown there. So that's a little bit about me and my institution. And like I said, so Kenneth, you could advance, please. Like I said, my major objective in coming up here was really to kind of improve the mechanics internally of how we handle graduate students. And I've listed some of these, the more important players that I've used since I've gotten here on campus here on this slide. And oddly enough, my 2 biggest go-to folks to solve some of the problems that I've been faced with, and in fact to improve the understanding and the willingness to handle graduate students by faculty, oddly enough, have been legal counsel and human resources. Legal counsel has been invaluable to me to give good advice on how students should be viewed as students, and where the definition of a student stops, if you will, as well, and in the light of some of those students being graduate assistants, which in our system, they're employees. And we're a system, a regental system, where the Board of Regents supervises 6 universities. And so we have policies written very broad policies that each one of the institutions have to kind of wedge themselves into. And so sometimes those policies aren't quite as clear or precise as you would like. So to understand what our legal requirements are, how you handle employees, how you handle students, legal counsel and human resources has been invaluable. And of all the things that I've been able to do here on campus, I consider this is one of my most important achievements, and that is I really have been able to push all the way down, and it feels like pushing sometimes, push all the way down to the department level, where I do think department heads now really have a much better understanding of the difference between graduate students and graduate assistants. And that really has improved tangibly, and I can give hard examples of this if you wish, of where students have gotten better treatment, have gotten more transparent treatment. Faculty now understand the system, and they don't get caught between these supposedly competing rules and regs. And it's been a real benefit for us. And so I've done this primarily through policy. So it's advocacy through policy. And I generally try to develop better policy through two sources of information. And one are in fact the people that I'm speaking to right now. It's you folks in CGS. So the CGS Deans Network has been really a resource for me that's been remarkable. I have used the Dean's Discussion Board as a resource for how to best put in good policy, which is just a form of advocacy. The networking at the meetings, as well as these webinars. And the second is my faculty group, the Graduate Council. And so between the faculty group, my own problem solving and the CGS Deans Network, I feel like I really have been a very effective advocate for students in terms of writing good policy and separating some things out, and as well as motivating some students to perform at a higher level. I've done it through policy, strangely enough. I think that's true. The other aspect that I think I have been effective advocate that's maybe not obvious, and it wasn't obvious to me when I came up here, is using our technology transfer office. It's not on the slide here, but the technology transfer office, who is responsible for writing all of the contracts that the university is engaging with external entities and companies that are trying to do research with the institution. There's a lot of these companies that want to get access to our faculty, and invariably graduate students will become part of these research efforts. And a lot of those contracts weren't necessarily written where if a graduate student was generating data for their thesis or dissertation, that it guaranteed that we could keep a hold of that data. Oftentimes the contracts just gave it away back to the company if that was the purpose of the contract. And I was having students losing opportunities for a thesis or dissertation because the data wasn't sufficiently protected in these contracts. So I would encourage you, if you haven't, think about who writes the contracts for these external agencies, and make sure that they are aware that graduate students that are working inside those, if they're going to be told those data are for your thesis or dissertation, then make sure that's in the contract and it's clear to everyone. And I now have our vice president for research and the fellow who directs these contracts, our technology transfer officer, call me up on a regular basis. They shoot me contracts, making sure that the graduate students are taken care of, being an advocate for graduate students in this legal limbo, and they get often left out, I've found, has been very effective. And again, I have an excellent working relationship now with that office, because I've talked a lot about how we need to be thinking about graduate students and the access to data and ensuring that the progression to a degree is not impeded because of the language in these external contracts. And so those two kind of areas are what you might not expect to find, allies for your advocacy, but it's worked well for me. The others, I think, are maybe a little more predictable. Our marketing and communications. We have an office that works with our graduate school staff to produce stories that are published through the marketing and communication. We funnel them the names, principally the names of winners of our competition, like the 3MT or our research competition, and they do big write-ups, and they publish this to alumni, to external constituents, and they're happy to get it. They do all the photography, and we don't have any time in this, and this is really important because I have a very small staff that's not always available to spend time on those kinds of things. Other offices we use, financial aid office we use those often for data for how students are performing in terms of their loans and whatnot. That's been in the public perception and public eye here recently quite a bit. Our institutional research office has also been very, very useful as well for getting the data. I put assessment up here, and we just had an office for assessment. SDSU is now focusing on assessment, and assessment of student learning other than assigning grades is what I mean. And I've had a real successful relationship through the assessments office, trying to get programs to build in the right kinds of assessments and to assess maybe novel activities in their graduate programs that I wouldn't otherwise be able to get any traction with. So, for example, I've asked through our assessment activities in our assessment office for everyone's developing student learning outcomes for their graduate programs, which they're now committed and they're required to do this, to think about, these professional development skills, to think about assessing small group communication, for example, to think about being able to resolve difficult situations, the communication to the lay audience, awareness of regulatory events, and all of these outside of the discipline, and all of these other kinds of soft skills, critical thinking outside of the discipline. These soft skills that our students really need. I've been successful in getting some graduate programs to really consider this sincerely because it was coming officially through the assessment office. And again, I've also used government relations office to be advocates here on campus because they have the access to the president for thinking about graduate students when thinking about what kinds of activities that we need to be encouraging our federal regulators to actually put into law. So we have some handouts, and I have Kenneth, you could advance, have a mock-up of some of our handouts. We give, this is from 2016, this year before last, we give these out to local politicians. We hand them out on campus as well as off campus, local businesses, trying to get the word out about our graduates, about our graduate school. We have developed a professional development program down there in the corner, and trying to get the word out to businesses that we're working on some of these softer skills with our graduates. So that's just an example of the kind of thing you can do quickly and easily and cheaply to develop some of these handouts. So Kenneth, if you could advance. For external advocacy, I've said, like, the government relations office has been critical to build that relationship with your external relations officer. Mine has been very encouraging to just keep him informed of what's going on, and I've been encouraged to engage at the federal level as much as I can, and I just make sure that there's a wide open channel of communication between he and I, and I use materials from the issue briefs from the CGS team, the national team, doesn't have a problem with that, and I pass that information on to him, and it is often used by his office as well. I reach out to the local Chamber of Commerce. We have a collaborative effort here across that divide, where we're trying to promote entrepreneurship. And so I meet and I speak with on a regular basis of the local Chamber of Commerce representatives to promote some of their maker spaces and their activities for having students to encourage entrepreneurship and whatnot. And because of that, I have a lot more conversations now than I did when I first started about graduate school, about graduate students with our civic leaders here on campus. I also have a little program. I'm trying to encourage faculty members to get out and go to some smaller schools and present themselves as speakers on the content, whether they're engineers or biologists or chemists or whatnot, to get out and promote the graduate school through these unpaid speakers for other universities. That program is still getting off the ground. It's not quite as robust as I would like. But the last thing I have listed is college and department advisory boards. Our engineering college is very active with their advisory boards, and I've been invited in, and I've kind of invited myself in on some of these to set in and talk about graduate education to these advisory boards, and making sure that doesn't leave the conversation there. And again, that's been very successful. I now have a relationship with one of our local HR directors from a fairly large company who's very interested in graduate students and graduate education, professional development, and other things. And again, it was another avenue that I've used to get the word out about graduate education and getting some traction in there as well. And so Kenneth, just one more slide, and I would like to leave with, I haven't done this as well as perhaps I could or I should. It's on my list of things to do, but I'd like to talk about it a little bit. And maybe, John, you can say something about this, but I'm trying to establish a charitable giving program here in the graduate school, and that's going to have to be done through our foundation, and that's been a little bit tough. It's tough to break into this. The foundation they have certain things that they want to sell to their donors, and so getting on their list I'm still not quite there, but I would encourage you to think about reaching out to these people on your campus to see if there's if they wouldn't be receptive to promoting some of the programs that you have or the needs that you have for your students. And now you've just recruited these people into your little circle of folks who are going to go out and talk about graduate education, talk about the needs of graduate students. And again, because I know your staffs are not that robust. And the last is civic organizations. I've heard a number of my fellow graduate deans talk about an excellent way to advocate for what your students are doing, what your university is doing, and what the needs are of your graduate programs is through civic organizations such as Rotary. And I'm very close to joining our Rotary Club just to check this out. I'm interested to see if anyone else on the call has had experiences with civic organizations as tools for advocacy, and that way maybe I could learn something too. But I think this is a real potential for graduate deans, and we don't talk very much about it. And I think it's an unexplored area of what we need to be doing. And so with that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Kencho, and thank you, Beth and Kenneth, for getting the program organized for today. And thank you for the participants for taking some time this afternoon to listen to what Kencho and I have to contribute to the cause here in terms of promoting graduate education and highlighting the importance of graduate education at our institutions. So just to give you a little bit of background, yeah, you can see basically my business card. I've been the graduate dean and associate provost for graduate and professional education at Iowa for finishing up my 18th year, interestingly enough. So I've been doing this a long time. And I was recently asked by our president to assume the role of interim vice president for research and economic development, which has afforded me, it's an interesting opportunity to revisit not only our research mission on our campus, but also when I first came to the University of Iowa a long time ago, the two offices were co-joined and administered by one individual, and then, like many institutions, split up. But it's been affording me the opportunity to envision and rethink about how graduate education and the research and scholarship that our students partake in is critical to the research and scholarly enterprise of our institution. So the University of Iowa is a Research One institution. We're very proud to be a member of the AAU group, the American Association of Universities, the 60-some plus institutions in the United States that have that membership designation. We have about 5,000 plus graduate students and over 125 graduate programs, 75 of which have doctoral degrees, have PhDs. And as Kinchel mentioned out at South Dakota State, we also have had an emergence and an evolution of some of our master's programs in clinically oriented areas that have now developed their own clinical doctoral degree programs too. Doctor of Nursing Practice, Doctor of Physical Therapy, and Doctor of Audiology. And that's, was sort of an interesting evolution in my time as dean, but it really follows along in the mantra of the perspective of at least the University of Iowa, that we've had other creative doctorate degrees emerge out of master's degrees as well, way before my time. And I'm thinking of the Doctor of Musical Arts in particular that has emerged from a creative art sort of perspective, excuse me, into the doctoral realm of degree offerings. So we're very proud of where we reside at the moment. And, there's a lot going on, as we all know, at all institutions. And next slide, Kenneth, please. What I show here is a very similar chart to a bulleted list of groups and organizations that I try to intersect with on our campus. There's a lot of similarities between the bullet positions that Kinchel presented, as well as mine. He has a few different than me. I have a few different than him, but they're generally all along the same sort of realm, in that what I want to try to emphasize is that our job as graduate deans to advocate on behalf of graduate education is a huge job. And as one of my colleagues that I've known for many years in the graduate dean community says, anytime you have a chance to talk about graduate education, it's an opportunity for advocacy. And I've taken that to heart in thinking about how to talk to individuals about the importance of graduate education. Unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, at a large institution like ours, and I suspect that many others, graduate education is sort of the, I don't want to think about it like this because I know it's how important it is, but it's not immediately on people's minds. The undergraduate mission and the prominence of our professional colleges and professional education clearly dominates the scene, and graduate education sort of that third tier that intersects with the other two, and it's often sort of a forgotten child, but never more important in terms of advancing the mission of the institution. So the way I think about these groups and people and organizations that are listed here, and is increasingly importance of sort of very local within the graduate college. So our own personnel, the graduate students we work with, our coordinators, directors of graduate studies, et cetera, on the left, and then emerging over into a little bit more of a distant connection to the campus and elsewhere that needs to know about what we're doing in graduate education. So the way I sort of constructed this was to think that all of our graduate colleges, I assume, either have their own sort of mission and vision statements or have a connection to the university's strategic plan. And as you move along these bulleted categories on the left and then over into the right, it's really important to be able to very quickly articulate how the work that we do in the graduate college and in the graduate education enterprise at our institutions help advance the strategic plan, because that's really what the increasing importance of, or in distance perhaps from the graduate college, that the individuals on the right want to know is why does a graduate college exist? What are you doing for us? And how is it advancing the mission of the institution? And to have information very quickly at your hands to be able to articulate that comes in quite handy. One of the things that I've really come to learn, and as Kinchel and I have had these offline conversations in the past, in many different opportunities, is that graduate deans need to be really good team players. We help support a lot of the efforts that are going on in the colleges. And if you think, for example, from philanthropic sorts of opportunities, which we are trying to yet re-engage and re-envision how we do that here on our campus with our Center for Advancement, one of the things that immediately comes up is whose alumni belong, where are the alumni of our graduate programs? Where's their allegiance? Is it to their individual programs, to the grad college, a combination, et cetera? So we have to be constantly thinking that we are in the business of supporting what people do, and more aligned with the successes that I've been able to see at Iowa and to implement we don't try to duplicate what other people are trying to do. We try to supplement and fill in gaps where we see that they exist. These are in terms of policies, procedures, funding opportunities, professional development opportunities, as Kinchel mentioned as well, and then developing partnerships where people are interested and willing to participate with us to overall advance the mission of graduate education on our campus. And if you have the opportunity to be at your institution over a period of time, you'll start to develop a lot of camaraderie, a lot of confidence, a lot of trust with the colleagues that are in each of these categories, so that they trust what you're doing is really trying to advance the mission of their students in their programs in their colleges at their institution. So it's sort of a team effort, and it takes a little bit of time to build that, for the lack of a better way of describing it, that street credibility with these individuals in trying to advance the educational mission. Next one, Kinchel, please, or Kenneth, please. So much like Kinchel said, these are some very quick handouts, and we rearranged these, quite frankly. This is just an example of some of the highlights from that we use for the graduate college and conversations that we have with different audiences, and we mix and match these points with many others depending upon the audiences that we're trying to discuss with. But you can see over on the side, this was used, or parts of this was used very recently with an effort that we partook in a couple of weeks ago by taking 5 very prominent high quality graduate students working in research areas and scholarly areas that intersect with key legislators in the state of Iowa legislature. This is part of what we call the Iowa Hawkeye Caucus, that a large number of the campus organizations go to Des Moines and basically advocate on our behalf. We take this approach with our students, and they actually call certain senators and legislators out of session to talk to them about the work. And we try to articulate to them that graduate education at the University of Iowa serves all 99 counties, and we just don't recreate the faculty of the future. We also, our graduate products, are the products of graduate education. Our alumni move into virtually every category of career opportunities that one can think of, and just some examples that are shown here: education, industry, research, business, healthcare, and government, et cetera. Are really important, and we have alums that are moving into all these different areas, both in the state, in the nation, and internationally as well. A little bit about our enrollments and our graduate programs. Yeah, I can see our graduate degree programs are larger than I remember them being. 168, I was thinking more like 125. So we have more than I thought. Some of our programs are very highly ranked. We're proud of that. We do very well in terms of our graduate research, in terms of the Council of Graduate Schools dissertation prizes competition. We do well there too, and we're very, very proud of that. One of the things that really resonates, and I just use this with our Center for Advancement, is that we consider these 5 National Dissertation Prize winners at the CGS sort of like the Heisman Trophy winners of graduate education any given year. So we have 5 of these. We have 1 football Heisman Trophy winner from the University of Iowa. And to compare that sort of analogy has resonated a lot with people, and I'm using that a lot to demonstrate the high quality nature of the research and scholarship that our students undertake. So in essence, we're trying to show that we perform multiple roles. We have a lot of different service opportunities. Our graduates go off and do a lot of really interesting things. But what really works well when we're advocating, particularly with not only people on campus, but the community and external folks, as Kenchel mentioned. Next slide, Kenneth, please. Is we really try to do a good job of telling stories of our students. And here's just two individuals that we've used in some materials in the past. Rachel Graber is a social work student who graduated a few years ago. She's actually working in a very important area in DC on domestic violence. Very prominent individual, was one of our top students when she was here as a graduate student. And then Jim Jordal is a PhD student, or former PhD student in environmental science, who's working with the Iowa Agricultural Alliance to look at, soil quality, water pollution, and things like that. And is also very interested in working internationally, as you can see from this little tidbit. These are very powerful statements to share with a variety of different folks to show that our students don't just go off to become faculty members. That's a misnomer, as you all well know anymore, and that our students really need to be prepared to go out into the workforce and a whole host of different kind of career opportunities. So we mix and match all these kind of different stories. And we're very fortunate that we're large enough graduate college. We could certainly use more staff, as everyone could, but we're very fortunate to have a couple of communications folks working in this area, and they work throughout the year trying to identify really interesting students doing interesting work, prize winners, local competitions, internal campus competitions, and whatnot. Find storylines that work with our central strategic communications folks from campus to find students that we can then use for future advocacy opportunities. And these are, Rachel and Jim are two of the examples that we've used in the past. So next one, Kenchel. So one of the things that's worked real well, actually here you can see two of our students that that went to Des Moines with us a couple of weeks ago to advocate with our legislators. We're in a very, very Republican state that often these individuals don't resonate very well with the kinds of things that go on in a blue community like Iowa City and the university. But the two students you see here, Jeremy Williams on the left is talking to a legislator who happens to, Jeremy is well, he defended his PhD last week. Well, actually 2 days after the Hawkeye Caucus, but Jeremy is working in education programs for veterans. He is currently a U.S. Army officer reservist in the state of Iowa, and he's talking to a legislator in his area in Marshalltown, Iowa, where the veterans home is, and has a very interesting and a lot of varied interests in veterans affairs and things like that. They immediately hit it off because of the connection with the military and with the veterans. Over on the right, you see another student from our College of Nursing who is very much interested in more advanced techniques for identifying and screening cancer in certain patient populations. And in certain pockets of the state of Iowa, we have very high incidences of certain kinds of cancers. And she's talking to a legislator who happens to be in one of those districts about the opportunity to advance different kinds of colorectal cancer, I think, in this particular case. So again, we do a lot of investigation, a lot of research on our strategic communications people, both in the graduate college and on campus. Our chief communications person fortunately sits on sort of the team working group for our central strategic communications. So she's very aware of what's going on across campus and interesting stories that we can be using to our advantage as well. And then, of course, we're always willing to share back with colleges and with departments and programs stories that we've come up with about their students that they may or may not have realized. One of the things that we also are moving into, even though I am of an old school generation, we actually have a couple of undergraduate students that work in our communications office that do an awful lot of social media work for us. Twitter, Facebook for the graduate college, LinkedIn with the graduate college and our faculty and our students. And we really try to perform a service that we can communicate very rapidly about certain kinds of things, connecting, for example, with our graduate student government, our graduate professional student government, our undergraduate student government, on Twitter and these other social media platforms that can share information very, very rapidly. That seems to be how the younger generation communicates and hears information much more so than if we put something on our website or that kind of thing. So it's a very useful way to share information. And in fact, a lot of legislators and other people that we intersect with also respond to the highly technological world, and they're picking up a lot of these things and following the activities that we have. It's another way, subtle but very, very important, as we move to the future of how do we communicate with people about the value and importance of our graduate educational programs. So if you're in a large institution and you have this capability, think about ways that your communication people in your own office can work. If you're at an institution that does not have that ability, find out who your strategic communications people are at the institution and try to work the best you can with them as well. It's not always, even at large institutions with a lot of staff, it's not always possible to do all of these things by yourself. And that's why I think Kinchel and I both have taken the view that we know what we can do, but we also need to know what other people can do to help us as well. And that's why these partnerships across campus, without duplicating work between the offices, because that's never good, because somebody's gonna be liable then to having adjustments made in their organizational structure. You want to partner with people and fill in gaps where they may exist. And I would have to admit, as Kinchel alluded to, I'm in this job for a long time, and I still virtually learn something, not virtually necessarily, but I learned something almost every day that we could be doing better and different and with new approaches and new technologies and new perspectives. So I would always avail yourselves to listening to all those different groups that we both articulated earlier in our presentations about who we communicate with, because if you have open ears and open minds, you can do a lot more than if you just think your way is the right way to do it. Again, a lot of the successes, Kinchel alluded to this as well, it's this advocacy, and a lot of advocacy to help promote graduate education perspectives from the college's office and the dean's office is sharing best practices, sharing information, sharing your perspectives, cajoling people into doing the right thing. And even if they don't think you're correct, if you present your case and you do it in a cordial, friendly way, they'll begin to understand that they've got, they develop credibility with you, or you develop credibility with them, and we'll start to begin to move things in a positive direction to your benefit. So again, this teamwork philosophy, together everyone achieves more. I've learned that the hard way in some cases early in my career, and I'm learning now that it's really a really good perspective to have. So, and we need to do this in times of very tight fiscal constraints and perspectives on higher education, both in our local communities and of course statewide and nationally. So with that, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to try to present, and I think Kinchel and I are both more than willing to try to answer any questions you might have, and we're happy that you were able to join us for the presentation today.
Do I? Okay. Thank you both, Kinchel and John. I think clearly from what you had to say, it's as important to find and do your advocacy internally as it is to have your ability to advocate externally. And who those getting people more aware of how graduate education interacts with and supports the strategic plans, the mission of the institution, and also creating internal champions for graduate education outside of the graduate school through these relationships that you build, in addition to making sure that people understand the kinds of services and needs that graduate students have. One of the questions I would ask you, and then we can get started with everyone else, is do you use different materials or different information when you're advocating internally as opposed to with external audiences such as policymakers and other stakeholders?
Yeah, I think I can take a crack at that first, Beth. And I know Kinchel will add in, I know, because he has similar perspectives as I do. I think you need to balance the materials that you put together. And that's why I think we both just showed examples of leave behind materials, as we call them, that highlight different kind of aspects of things that we're doing in our college. If we know the audience that we're going to talk to, we can certainly frame these materials to help meet the needs and interests of that audience to understand what we're doing. If you're kind of going in blind to a different group, you kind of have to have some generic materials first to set the stage as to what your graduate college is about, how graduate education fits into the university's mission and such, that we both showed at the beginning of our presentation, particularly Kensho with his overview of South Dakota State. So we target our materials as much as possible to the audience that we have to talk to. And that varies dramatically between people on campus, local community versus more external. So for example, when we go to the state capitol, or we go to the federal legislators, when we do the work with CGS or on our own, from our own institutions, we tailor that material to meet the needs and interests of how we're trying to promote things to those kinds of audiences as well. One of the things that I do want to, neither one of us mentioned it, but it's really useful information that Central Council of Grad Schools office and Kenneth in particular put together of the state snapshots and of the state graduate education perspective. It's not just our, the University of Iowa, for example, in our state snapshot, but it's others as well. I've used that a lot in my conversations with external audiences to give them a perspective of where the University of Iowa fits in the whole graduate education enterprise with the state. And those are really useful materials. So I want to give a shout out to the central organization.
Kenshel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I would just like to echo, clearly my advocacy on campus is different than off campus. So on campus, I find myself going back to the best practices that we learn about through all of our interactions through CGS, with the provost, with the other deans of the college, the actual academic colleges. I talk about how we could improve graduate education and how we could improve student experience through these best practices. And I think they're very receptive to that. As I mentioned, I've done that through policy, but I've also, used best practices as ways to start conversations with deans, just to get them to think about talking with their department heads about how we could improve some things for graduate students. And as John said, when you go off campus, then it is a different game. I use the issue briefs quite a bit with our federal delegation, and with the Chamber of Commerce things that I have, I talk about the different kinds of graduate students that we have and what would be the best approach to get those students off campus into their into their activities. And the handout that I showed is generally for off campus. And so yeah, you certainly have to think about what your audience is and what your goals are in order to have any success in reaching those audiences.
Are there any questions from those who are on the webinar? Well, let me ask another question then. Do you work with graduate students to develop any of the materials that you use, either one of you?
We usually interact with the student if we're going to use those students in specific promos, like John had to talk about his nursing student. We do ask the student for permission to use their likeness and use their activities. I also try to take any kind of policy changes past a group of students, and I've learned very much that sometimes students are hard to get to engage. They're very engaged in what they're doing, in the lab or in the field or their coursework. But sometimes it takes effort to go find the graduate students to get them to engage.
John?
Yeah, I would agree with that. When we're developing materials, again, being an older school guy, I'm actually on Twitter, but I don't use it an awful lot. I follow a lot, however. But students being our undergraduate students that we have are so knowledgeable about this. We often talk to the graduate students about what kind of things resonate with them when we do these materials, when we do some distribution of information via those networks. One of the things that I have done an awful lot each year is to try to work very closely with our officers in our graduate student senate and our graduate and professional student government. Because if you can advocate for them and gain their trust that you really are trying to advance graduate education, they're going to then go back to their constituents and echo those words and support what you're trying to accomplish. So I work very closely with those officers on a monthly basis, if not more, to try to accomplish some of the things that we want to try to accomplish internally. So every one of these groups that you have to talk to, you have to flavor and tailor your comments and your approach a little bit different based upon what you're trying to accomplish with each group. And the overarching messages can be the same, but the way that you communicate those messages might be different and need to be different depending upon the audience that you have.
Okay.
But yes, we work with students a lot on how we do our messaging.
Okay. So you gather data, you gather information, you have these student stories. Kinshal, for example, you said you hand this over to the Central Communications Office. And I'd be interested in knowing if you have any other input other than providing the stories to them. Do either of you have input in terms of the design of these materials, or who does the design of the materials, for example?
No, we would have input into the design of those materials in any way that we would want. It comes down to the fact that, you know, how much staffing time are we going to place to this? But what I found is the communications team, they do a pretty good job. You know, with the content is general content. It's designed for general awareness. They send it out to alumni and a number of external stakeholder groups that aren't necessarily alumni. And so I haven't found necessarily the need to specifically ask them to do it this way. That's something that I think that I personally could get better at, thinking out on how to use this resource more effectively. But again, it's something that it works fairly well the way it is.
Yeah, one thing that I would point out, again, we're fortunate that we have our several communications people in our office. One actually came, the leader of that group, of that 3-person group, came from our University of Iowa Philanthropy Foundation a number of years ago. So she had a lot of skills in developing materials for wide broadcasting distribution, if you want to call it that. Our other individual is a really good story writer and a really good web designer. He worked in the local media industry for many, many years. And the third person, well, actually, it's a 1 FTE, but 3 students that work in that area for all the social media. One of the things so we can construct these kind of frameworks, but we have to do it in sort of the overall arcing design that our central strategic communications people want, sort of the University of Iowa branding sort of approach, and that's fine with us. We've been given, as long as we work within that framework, we're given pretty much carte blanche to how to design things that we want to send out our messages.
Okay.
One thing I did want to, I neglected to mention this earlier, is another route to help distribute your information and your advocacy on behalf of graduate education is your local media. And I say this because I recollect a couple of weeks ago there was the national week-long celebration of graduate and professional students that we participated on. We had a lot of activities going on to celebrate graduate students on campus. And I actually wrote a piece. I've been writing several pieces to our local student newspaper, the Daily Iowan, over the year on a variety of different subjects that are going on campus. But you know, she pretty much, the editor called me a few weeks before that. She said, hey, I know I'm interested in knowing what's going on, what you guys are doing for this week-long celebration. And I said, well, I'd like to write a guest editorial highlighting the prominence and this sort of thing that would be published on Monday morning, the first day of the event. She goes, send me what you got and we'll get it printed. And so we did that, and it was a really good way. I had a lot of nice comments from people across campus that was a really powerful message celebrating our students. The students liked it a lot to help them promote their week-long celebration and their activities. So I've learned over the years too that the media can be your friend. Doesn't have to be the opposition with certain things, even though they may disagree with you. If you again work with them, you are cordial with them, and try to help them, particularly the students on the student newspaper. I've always used the notion that they're students. I'm still faculty. I want them to do a good job, because if they do a good job, the paper is going to look good. The graduate colleges look good. Everybody's going to be happy. So it's a win-win-win all the way around. So I work with them pretty carefully on materials that can go into the local newspaper, student newspaper, that can help promote our cause. And they've responded that way. So we have a really good editor this year that likes to work that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of how you work with the graduate students. I mean, the other option is if you have a program in design, or if you have a program in computer technology where you can develop materials, you might want to work with the students in those programs to help you develop materials if you don't have, for example, a communications office or a publications office or a place where the branding gets done, et cetera. So there are other ways to reach out and get materials developed when you don't necessarily have standard resources on your campus. And I don't know if others have questions, so we'll wait and pause for a moment to see if there are questions from people online. Well, one question, I mean, and I sort of led into it for the two of you. You both come from fairly well-resourced, I'm going to phrase it that way, or larger institutions. What about the smaller institutions that don't necessarily have as many resources or options as you all have? What advice would you provide to them?
She didn't even look at her email.
No, that's a lie.
So I would say that you can't do it all at once. So all these things at once. We've given you a lot of broad areas that we advocate on behalf. A lot of touch points on campus, off campus, nationally. I would say that figure out where you need to start first. Where is the first sets of audiences that you need to be able to construct your advocacy notes and messages, and then figure out what would the best way to be to communicate with those people, and then find people on campus that would then help you do that. So an example that Beth just mentioned, if you don't have your own web designer or communications people that can put together these really interesting, cool left behinds, one of the things you could think about doing is, what if you have resources in your college, support a student in that computer programming area, or out of the business college where they're doing a lot of marketing and communications people. The two undergrads that we hired, as I mentioned, in the social media, they're both in the communications program here and are very interested in marketing, social media kinds of applications for when they move on to their futures. So you can think of different ways to utilize the resources that you have on your own campus to help you. But I think the first thing to do is to set up who your first sets of messages are, how to develop those, and then the more you talk to people on campus, the more you're going to get ideas about how to do things, and that'll just sort of unfold in terms of the people that you need to interact with to help you accomplish your job. And they'll be appreciative if you're providing opportunities for their students to develop their own professional development skills. I mean, we found that to be true here at Iowa.
Yeah, I would echo what John just said. Think about very carefully what you want to get done, and find those specific resources that can help you do this. I came from before I was here, I came from an institution that was a master's only institution. We didn't have really any PhD degrees. And what I found there was there's always somebody sitting in a graduate program that's responsible for, getting students in and out of the program. We call them graduate coordinators here. You call them lots of different things. And those folks have a lot of good ideas on how, what the needs are, how to make things run better. And at smaller institutions, the group of people here is it can be relatively small, that can be to your advantage, and you can bring those people together and really get some good ideas about what needs to be done and how to do it. And I found that they're very proactive, and they want to grow their graduate programs because they're so unique in these situations. So I would be tempted in that situation, Beth, that you just described, as to get as close to the students as I could with these graduate program directors and really bring them in as a group of advisors on how to proceed to advance graduate education across campus. I bet you would get some really good advice, because these people typically are quite motivated.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. The other suggestion I have is there are people on your campus that already have and develop leave behind materials. For example, your government relations representative. Do you know what's in there about graduate education? And you can be very helpful to them as they develop those materials, because they're the ones that are external with respect to the policymakers, and make sure that what they have in their materials sufficiently represents the importance and the contribution of the graduate students and the graduate education programs you have. So that's another place to utilize resources that are already developed and are being used as a way to also get your message out. Well, I want to thank...
Maria has a question.
Oh, Marie? What's the question?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I wanted to share an experience with the kind of information that was very welcome when I made a visit to the Congresswoman, where the district that our university is in is her district. During my trip to DC, my dean's assistant actually for the long time had worked for a congressman and is very connected in politics and knows and understands how our politicians think, both at a federal and at the state level. And it was her idea to look at our alumni database. We now finally have an alumni database because I'm also doing development. And she found a way to display data of the number of graduate alumni with masters and with PhDs that live in the district of our representative. Of course, it was scrubbed of names and any specific information. And so when I visited the office and I handed them this information, because this district also includes parts of Milwaukee that where they always get bad news, always about things that are not working, the things that are wrong. It was so warmly welcomed. They were like, oh my God, we have all these masters and PhDs that live in our district and we never even knew about them. So I just wanted to share that experience. And I have a question that is kind of, maybe you've already addressed that, is that at my university, there is only one person who is doing all legislative connections. That's our Vice Chancellor for University Relations, who doesn't even have a staffer who is doing that. Everything depends only on one person who goes both to Madison and to DC, and who engages the Chancellor. So the deans are usually not asked to be part of that. Through CGS, I've been able to start to make visits, and where we are is now I am not allowed and welcome to advocate for graduate education at our institution, but I'm not allowed to make any asks. And we heard from staffers at various CGS meetings that they usually, when there is a meeting, they want to hear an ask. They don't like meetings when there is never an ask after whatever materials are presented. So do you have any advice for this kind of situation, and how should I navigate this situation?
Kinchel or John? That's when I think you need to work with your government relations person Because if they're the ones that are going to be able to make the ask, then you need to work with them to find out what the things are that they are focused on, what the priorities are of your administration, and then within that context, help them understand how graduate education and how the graduate student needs or things that they, why they're different from the undergraduate ask per se, so that you're not just seeing and hearing undergraduate asks. But that's when you have to really develop that relationship with your government relations person so that they better understand how they can make an ask that is beneficial not only for the undergraduates, but for the graduate students and graduate education.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say if again, that person, that one individual on your institution's got a really hard job if they're trying to do both of those by themselves. Undoubtedly, that's hard. But then my question would be, then if you go to Madison or you go to DC on behalf of your institution and you can't sort of advocate and provide an ask to your local representative or senator or what have you, then sort of like, what's the point of you going there? I would say then maybe if the person who does the ask is the one individual, I'd say, hey, I'd like to go with you because there might be things that come up that you don't exactly know about or know a lot of detail about, et cetera, that I can provide additional information. So basically, you're supporting them in their work, and hopefully they're supporting you in your work. I mean, if it's sort of a matter of who can do the ask, quote unquote,
and the other
join up with it, go together.
The other thing is that if you provide information about the impact of something on your undergraduate education or the graduate students, that's the other side of an ask, because you might say that our students are having difficulty with something, or our financial aid office is limited by something. You don't necessarily have to make the ask, but you can point out an area of concern. And then if they ask, you can say, well, I will work with my government relations person to get that information to you.
Right.
So have them ask you for what it is that they want to know. So you set it up that way, because that's, we lobby, there's the fine line between advocating and lobbying in many respects, but basically if you lead them to where there are concerns or problems, and then they ask you for, how would you deal with this? How would you solve this? What do you need to be able to change this? You can either say, oh, you might want to think about this, or you can say, let me work with our government relations person so we can provide a formal response to you.
Those are wonderful suggestions. Thank you very much. Definitely going together, and also providing information about asks that are important to campus, or driving towards asks by sharing from the materials from the Council of Graduate School. Those are all great ideas. And this was the quick follow-up. One of the rationale behind the structure that we have is that then the notion is that none of our deans need to worry about having to say that we also have lobbying activities, because we are in a very regulated states and they're asking us for all sorts of things. And so one of the arguments behind the structure that we have is that that's what it's supposed to achieve, that nobody else has to say that we're lobbying.
Right. Exactly. Well, I think our time has come to a close. I want to really thank everybody who joined us, and I want to thank Kinshal Dorner and John Keller in particular for taking the time to talk with you about the things that they do on their campus and the kinds of materials and relationships that they've developed to better get across the importance and the value and the connectivity of graduate education and graduate students to the mission and to the goals of the institution. I also want to remind our participants that we have a webinar on May 31st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which is the closing webinar for the Advocacy Ambassador Network, this cohort. We will also be sending out a survey, and we certainly hope that you will respond to that survey so that we can have a robust conversation during that May 31st webinar. I also want you to think about and encourage you, since you've heard all of this information about how stories resonate with individuals, and whether it's on campus or with external constituents and stakeholders, to think about submitting a story to our grad impact. We're getting a lot of positive feedback with respect to the importance of grad impact, because it illustrates the breadth and the depth of the things that our graduate students are doing once by their research and by their participation in their community and industry, in nonprofits and government. So hopefully you will think about doing that as well as part of your experience as an advocacy ambassador. And with that, thank you, John, thank you, Kinchel, and thank you everybody that's been online.
Thank you very much.
Doesn't matter. I'm fine both ways. Doesn't care.